Greetings everyone. Welcome to CEC Gurukul lectures. I am Mehak Chawla, Bharatanatyam dancer, disciple of Guru Srimati Geeta Chandanji and an arts educator. We are going to continue with the art and aesthetic and symbolic life of Harappan civilization. In this, we are going to start with the seal carving which was being done or made by them. Let's study about it. The Harappan seals often carry images of animals, mythic beings and possibly proto-deities. The well-known Pashupati seal portraying a horned figure in a yogic posture surrounded by animals suggests a symbolic system involving meditation, nature and possibly early forms of deity worship. The next which we are going to study is about the symbolism and ritual objects. Artifacts such as painted pottery, amulets and ritual vessels show that symbolic and ceremonial life held great significance in this civilization. In performing arts, the evidence from archaeology, though no written records of performances survive, material evidence offers valuable insight into music, movement, ritual enactment and communal ceremonies. If we talk about dance, the archaeological findings suggest that rhythmic movement and expressive body postures were part of Harappan culture. The bronze dancing girl is the clearest example. Her poised stance, curved torso and ornamented body highlight an awareness of graceful movement and bodily expression. Terracotta figurines in dynamic postures indicate the practice of group or ritual movement activities. If we talk about music, the artifact reflecting sound production include conch shells which produce resonant tones and may have been used in rituals or gatherings. A terracotta bull with drum like hump interpreted by some scholars as a toy that produced rhythmic sound, suggesting familiarity with percussion. If we look into the drama, ritual and enactment, there is evidence of community gatherings involving ritual enactment. Fire altars discovered at Kalibangan point to ceremonial practices centered around sacred fire, possibly accompanied by chanting or rhythmic activity. Certain seals depict masked or stylized faces, hinting at the use of proto-mask in symbolic or ritual context, an early form of dramatic expression. After the decline of the Indus Valley civilization, large urban centers faded and the subcontinent entered a phase of rural settlement and pastoral communities. Into this changing landscape arrived the Indo-Aryan speaking groups whose cultural and ritual practices gradually spread across North India. Their hymns, chant and oral traditions formed the earliest body of sacred literature, the Ved. With this shift from archaeological evidence to a text-based culture, a new era began in which ritual, cosmology and social organization took center stage. This marks the beginning of Vedic period, the next major phase in the early Indian history. In Vedic period, it marks one of the most formative phases in the cultural and artistic history of Indian subcontinent. While no visual or sculptural evidence from this era survives in the same way as the Indus civilization, the Ved, particularly the Rig Ved, Samved, Yajurved and Atharvaved, provide some of the earliest textual references to music, dance, chants, ritual expression, and proto-theatrical performance. The artistic practices of this period were deeply connected with ritual worship, ceremonial activities, and cosmological worldview preserved by priestly communities. For clarity, the Vedic era is divided into the early Vedic period and the later Vedic period, each portraying distinctive cultural shifts that influence the performing traditions. In early Vedic period, it was largely pastoral and semi-nomadic, consisting of Aryan tribes who relied heavily on cattle rearing, sacrificial rituals, and the authority of priest, the Brahmin. Religion was centered around yagya, the sacrificial rituals performed to evoke natural deities such as Agni, Indra, Varuna, and Som. These rituals formed the nucleus of social and cultural life and naturally became the context in which early forms of performing arts emerged. Since ritual and performance were inseparable in this period, artistic expression was simultaneously spiritual, communal, and celebratory. In performing arts, if we look at performing arts in early Vedic periods, music and dance in early Vedic world were primarily ritualistic and designed to support the performance of yagya. The most significant contribution is the Samved, which is regarded as the earliest textual foundation of Indian classical music. It codifies melodic chanting, introduces the concept of swara, and classifies tonal patterns into uddata, which is raised, anuddata, which is lowered, and swarita, the falling. These distinctions reflect a sophisticated system of voice modulation that influenced later musical traditions. Connected closely with these ritual chants were instruments such as the veena, the flute, and various drums, including the dundubi. These instruments accompanied hymns, enhanced the atmosphere of sacrifice, and created rhythmic structures of ritual performance. The early Vedic texts also contain references to apsaras like Menaka and Urvashi, the celestial dancers renowned for their grace, as well as Gandharvas, who were divine musicians. Though symbolic, these references indicate an early conceptualization of dance and music as exalted divine arts. Dance was performed during yagya as a gesture of celebration, invocation, or offering, showing that movement was already being used as an expressive medium linked to spirituality and collective emotion. By the end of early Vedic phase, communities became more settled, agricultural output increased, and social structures began to crystallize. The early nomadic lifestyle gave way to permanent villages and budding towns. As a result, rituals grew more elaborate, assemblies gained social importance, and performance practices evolved beyond purely ritualistic context. These transformations mark the beginning of the later Vedic period, where society becomes more complex and artistic forms begin to diversify. The later Vedic period witnessed a shift from pastoral living to more settled agricultural communities, leading to the rise of cities, political kingdoms, and a more complex social hierarchy. Institutions such as sabhas, the assemblies, and samitis, the council, emerged as important cultural spaces where intellectuals, debate, recitation, and performance could take place. As society grew more structured, so did its artistic expression, which began moving beyond purely ritual context into more formalized and thematic forms. If we look into the performing arts in later Vedic era, as ritual become more elaborate, so too did the associated music and movement practices. Chants began to follow clearer structures, and the role of musicians and reciters gained prominence. Evidence of early protoforms of nritya, which is pure dance movement, nritya, which is expressive dance movement, and natya, the dramatic performance, can be traced to this period, particularly through the increasing use of gestures, storytelling, patterns, and dramatized narrative in ritual contexts. One of the most important developments was the rise of the Akhyana tradition, which involved storytelling through poetic narration, often accompanied by expressive gestures or dialogue. This tradition is considered an early precursor of dramatic literature. Additionally, the epics and itihas, early forms of historical and narrative accounts, began to emerge during this time, laying the groundwork for future textual traditions such as the Ramayana and Mahabharata. Royal courts and public gatherings likely hosted ceremonial performances that incorporate music, recitation, and proto theatrical elements. These practices gradually expanded the artistic landscape, preparing the cultural foundation upon which later performing traditions, including Natya Shastra based dramatic art, would eventually develop. By the end of later Vedic period, the social and political fabric of the subcontinent had undergone significant transformation. The once pastoral communities had evolved into settled agrarian societies supported by expanding iron technology, improved tools, and increasingly complex economic exchanges. The rise of permanent settlement, surplus production, and the growth of craft specialization led to the decline of tribal organization and the emergence of territorial identities. Political assemblies such as the Sabha and Samiti became more structured, eventually giving way to hereditary monarchies and centralized authorities. At the same time, social stratification intensified and orthodox ritualism grew in scale and complexity, causing sections of society to question earlier religious ideas and search for new paths. These economic, social, and intellectual shifts laid the groundwork for a major historical transition. The growth of population centers and networks resulted in the formation of 16 large states known as the Mahajanapada, marking the beginning of India's second urbanization. Alongside these developments, profound philosophical and spiritual responses emerged in the form of Buddhism and Jainism, movements that challenged ritual dominance and emphasized ethical conduct, self discipline, and universal values. Together, the rise of territorial states and the birth of new religious ideologies shaped a vibrant and transformative era. It is this dynamic historical moment that we now explore in age of Mahajanapada and Buddhism, Jainism. In this period marks a decisive turning point in early Indian history, which is characterized by profound economic, political, and cultural transformation. The earlier Vedic socio-political organization based on pastoral tribes gradually evolved into stable agrarian communities with defined territorial boundaries. This transition led to the emergence of 16 powerful states known as the Mahajanapada, as documented in Buddhist texts like the Anguttara Nikaya and Jain texts such as the Bhagavati Sutra. These states, ranging from monarchies like Magda and Kosala to republics like Vajji and Mala, represented a new political consciousness where authority was defined by territory rather than kinship, and where administrative structures became increasingly sophisticated. This period also witnessed the second urbanization of India, driven by the proliferation of iron technology, surplus agricultural production, the rise of a merchant class, and extensive trade networks connecting North India with the Deccan and regions beyond the subcontinent. Cities like Rajgir, Taxila, Kaushambi, Champa, Ujjain, Mathura, and Shravasti emerged as bustling centers of commerce, intellectual debates, ritual practices, and artistic innovation. The cultural dynamism of these cities provided fertile ground for the emergence of heterodox philosophical systems such as Buddhism and Jainism, which profoundly and shaped the intellectual and artistic life of the subcontinent. With rising social complexities, ritual orthodoxy, and hereditary privileges of the Brahminical systems came under scrutiny. New religious movements began to articulate ethical, egalitarian, and philosophical alternatives. This rich environment of debate, reform, and cultural experimentation leads us to a closer study of Buddhism and Jainism, whose influence extended deeply into the performing arts of India. If we look into the performing arts, Buddhism emerged under Siddhartha Gautam, the Buddha, who articulated a path grounded in moral discipline, which is Sila, the mindful concentration, which is Samadhi, and insight, the Prajna. While the philosophical core of Buddhism focused on liberation from suffering, the tradition developed a vast repertoire of cultural practices, rituals, and artistic expression that served both devotional and pedagogical purposes. In the oral tradition and sonic culture, early Buddhism was fundamentally oral. The teachings of Buddha, preserved as Tripitaka, were maintained through precisely structured chanting using cadence and pitch to ensure accuracy. Pali chants such as the Metta Sutta or Ratna Sutta represent early examples of liturgical rhythms. This sonic culture created a contemplative atmosphere in monasteries and shaped later musical traditions in countries influenced by Buddhism. If we look into the narrative pedagogy and didactic drama, Buddhist monks employed didactic storytelling to transmit philosophical ideas to lay communities. The Jatka tale stories of Buddha previous births became an especially powerful tool. These narratives involved heightened expressiveness, role portrayal, rhythmic speech, and gesture, essentially early forms of theatrical pedagogy. Many scholars identify these stories as precursors to Bhana and Prakarnaya, forms described later in the Natya Shastra. The emphasis on compassion, moral dilemmas, and human emotions shaped narrative aesthetics in later Indian theatre. If we look into the monastic performance practices, performance was not merely entertainment, it served spiritual and social functions. Monastic assemblies often involved recitations, dramatic reenactments, processional events, and even simple forms of ritual theatre depicting episodes from Buddha's life. These practices foreshadowed Buddhist ritual theatre in Southeast Asia, such as Buddha Charita enactment, and contributed to the evolution of symbolic mime and visual storytelling in India. If we look into the influence of visual and performing art in early Buddhist narrative art, such as that found at Bharhut, Sanchi, and Amravati, depicts scenes that correspond closely to performance tradition, including musicians, dancers, acrobats, masked figures, and storytellers. While Buddhism did not promote dance as a ritual obligation, it did absorb and utilize performance as a medium of moral education, leading to cross pollination between monastic communities and folk performers. Though Buddhism and Jainism emerged from the same intellectual milieu, Jainism cultivated a distinct aesthetic ethos, emphasizing restraint, non-violence, and philosophical dialogue to appreciate the diversity of performance tradition in this period. It is essential to examine Jain contribution. If we look into Jainism, we found which was founded by Mahavir, which emphasized the doctrines of ahimsa, the non-violence, aparigraha, the non-possession, and disciplined self-restraint, while Jainism shared the broader atmosphere of reform and introspection. Its approach to performance was significantly shaped by its ethical rigor. If we look into the verbal art of storytelling, the Jain monks engaged in storytelling, the katha, recitation, the swadhyaya, and debates, vad vivad, as tools of pedagogy. Jain stories such as Upasaka Dasaha provided vivid narrative examples of moral virtue and spiritual discipline. These narrative practices emphasize clarity, structured discourse, and intellectual engagement, distinguishing Jain performance as a verbal and philosophical art. If we study about the controlled movement and minimalism in Jain aesthetic life, the body is considered a site of discipline. Excessive physical display was discouraged. This ideology gave rise to a minimalist aesthetics where gestures were controlled, measured, and symbolic. The importance of restraint in Jain monastic communities created a counter aesthetic to more narrative driven Buddhist performances. This influence is visible in later theatre tradition emphasizing subtlety, internalization, and psychological depth. If we look into the dialogue tradition, the dialogues between teacher and disciple, central to Jain pedagogy, evolved into structured dramatic conversation. These dialogic forms contributed to the rich tradition of discursive drama in India and influenced later Sanskrit and Prakrit plays, where reasoned debate forms a dramatic core. Example in Nagananda and Madhurakshaka. While Buddhism and Jainism cultivated refined monastic aesthetics, the broader landscape of the Mahajanapada period witnessed the flourishing of vibrant folk tradition rooted in community rituals, daily labor, martial practice, and seasonal festivals. These parallel performances, cultures form the living base of Indian performing arts. If we look into the folk and tribal traditions, which is living performance culture, in this age of Mahajanapadas saw the expansion of diverse folk, tribal and community-based performance forms, many of which later contributed to the evolution of classical theatre and dance. The proto-form of Yakshagana. In coastal Karnataka, early narrative tradition involving music, storytelling and dramatic improvisation appear as proto-Yakshagana forms. These performances often centered on mythological tales, moral stories and ancestral lore, providing entertainment and collective identity to agrarian communities. If we look into Kudiyatam, the temple communities in Kerala began developing ritual enactment rooted in Sanskrit and Prakrit tradition, forming the early seeds of Kudiyatam, today acknowledged as one of the world's oldest theatrical forms. These proto-performances combined liturgical chanting with gestures and ritualized movement, prefiguring the codification seen in later centuries. If we see into the martial dance traditions, the martial communities practice vigorous movement traditions using leap, kicks, weapon movements and rhythmic footwork, resembling early Chow-like martial dances. These forms preserved combat techniques and simultaneously served rituals, celebratory and community building purposes. If we look into the mask and animal spirit dances, the various regions practice animal mask dances where performers embodied forest spirit, animals or mythic beings. These forms serve ritualistic, protective and festive functions while representing a worldview closely tied to nature and animistic belief system. With this, I conclude my lecture. Thank you.